Hi, Dennis. Good afternoon.
Hello, all right, and you, Rabbi?
Thank God. Well,
Good,
looks like we
man.
might be starting just with the two of us and see who's gonna.
Yeah,
We'll give it a minute or two,
absolutely, yeah.
and then we
Okay.
can see what happens in a minute.
Okay.
Right, here's David.
Okay.
Morning, good afternoon, should I say.
Hello.
Good afternoon. Good to see you, David. Welcome. Okay, I think it is 1 o'clock, and
Okay.
Yeah,
I'm going to share the screen. We'll get started. Hopefully, those who are still intent on joining us will be here shortly.
Good.
Okay, screen is up. Okay, Dennis, you've got a secret double there.
Now I'm just joining on my
The computer and his phone.
laptop as well. Yeah.
Okay,
So
excellent.
I'm
catch
Can you
up
see the
one
screen?
now.
and then stop the cell phone.
Okay, there you go. Okay, so I'm assuming you guys can see the screen there. We've got Dennis on his computer screen. David, good to see you. And I've got the text up. And let's get started. So we're in chapter 9. We're continuing to deal with the laws of the transfer of Tumah, the susceptibility of Tumah relating to food and liquids. And we're going to look, one of the points what we're going to look at is what happens to a liquid that solidifies and then perhaps turns back to a liquid. How do we deal with that? And we're also going to recall a principle that we have with regard to a minimum size of a food product that may itself be susceptible to ritual impurity, but will only transfer if it has a minimum size. So those are the kind of the principal themes that we touch on in today's lesson, and we will go through the halachot. So there you have it on your screen. Diane and Jeff and Kent, I see have just joined us as we were sharing introductory words, and we'll go straight into the halacha. First halacha, chapter 9, when oil or honey contract impurity, coagulate and become solid, and then return to a liquid state. See, here's the thing, right? Just to explain why it's critical to understand this. Liquid will always be a rishon l'tumah. It will be an initial stage of tumah. Food stuff can become progressively a lesser form of tumah. So it can be rishon, sheni, and then more sensitive foods like truma can become shlishi, and more sensitive foods like kochim can become revi. But liquid always has only one status of tumah. Foods can become progressively less intense tumah. And that's why here's an interesting situation. If you had something that was liquid, it then coagulated, so it would seem now that it's a solid, but now it goes back into a state of liquid. So the halacha is they are considered as first degree derivatives of impurity forever. Meaning, essentially what the Rambam is saying is that oil and honey are always considered liquid, even if for a time they coagulate and have some type of solidness to them, because they are liquids. This applies even if they solidify after contracting impurity. And as we don't say that the liquid then makes it something else. We consider it a liquid all along. And now that's not the case for all liquids, as we'll see here. He says, reitev, grisin, ve'acholav, sauce, groats, or milk. If these solidify, they are considered as foods, and intent is required for them to become susceptible to ritual impurity. So if it solidifies, it's considered food. But as we've said previously, because it's not a normal food, it's not normally eaten in its congealed form, in its hardened form, one would have to have an intent to be using it as food, and then it's solid. Now your intention makes it a food, and then it will be susceptible like all other food products, and it will be governed by the rules of impurity as they transform to food products. If food that was a primary derivative of impurity was a rishon, or an impure liquid touches them, they are considered as secondary derivatives, because that's how it works with food, right? It can be a sheni. If there are moist liquid on them, so they solidify, but they're still quite moist on the outside, they are considered as liquids, and they are deemed primary derivatives like a liquid. Okay, so it's a little bit, we're going to check exactly how solid, if they're still liquid, but when we consider it a solid, it's treated like food, so long as the intention is that it's going to be used as food. When it's still quite liquidy, it's considered as a liquid and will be treated as such. If they contracted an impurity while they were liquids and then froze and solidified, they are considered a secondary derivative, like food that contracted an impurity from impure liquids. So if it was liquid and then it's solidified, it becomes one step less, just as if liquid had touched the food. Different laws apply if they contracted an impurity when they were solid and then melted and became liquid. So now listen to this. If they were exactly the size of an egg or less. So when it comes to food stuff, and we'll recall that something, in order for a food product to transfer impurity, it has to be at the least the size of an egg. So if, let's say we're talking about a product that's exactly the size of an egg. So it's a solidified, a piece of a frozen milk or something, right? It's exactly the size of an egg. And then it starts to melt. So he says, then the liquid is pure. Why? Because what's happening is then the solid state is now actually less than the size of a kibetza, and therefore it doesn't transfer impurity. But if they are larger than an egg, if this condensed, coagulated, solid thing was larger than an egg, and then it starts to liquefy, so then the liquids will become impure. What's the rationale? That when the first drop is melted, it contracted impurity from the egg-sized portion of frozen liquid from which it melted, and then that drop will then impart impurity to all of the liquid that will melt afterwards. You're following? So if the hardened thing is exactly like the size of an egg, once it starts to liquefy, the solid is no longer the size of an egg in order for it to impart impurity. But if it's larger, once it starts to liquefy and it remains in the solid, the size of an egg, that is going to transfer impurity onto the liquid, and that liquid in turn will impart it to the rest of the liquid, and that's what would happen. Similar laws apply if a person who was impure due to contact with a human corpse, and then he squeezed a mass of olives or grapes that were made susceptible to ritual impurity. Okay, so the person is impure. He's holding grapes that have become, they were mukhshar, they've already come to contact with liquid. So now he's squeezing it. And in this scenario, he's not actually touching the liquid that's coming out of the grape or the olive. He's only touching the fruit itself. So if the fruit were only the size of an egg, the liquids produced are pure, providing the person does not touch the place from which the liquids are dripping. In other words, he doesn't touch the liquid itself. The rationale for the leniency is that the liquids are set aside in the food, as if it is a food was a separate entity. And therefore, when you squeeze it, right, we're talking about here that it's true because of the contact from the person who is now an avatuma, the fruit itself is richly impure. But when you squeeze out the liquid from it, that's considered something that was inside but separate to the food. And because the individual grape is smaller than the size of a beta, it can't transfer tuma to the liquid. That is, so long as this person himself doesn't touch the spot where the liquid's coming out of, right? And it's simply being dripped out of the fruit. Because the fruit itself can't transfer it, it will remain pure. If the grapes or olives were larger than the size of an egg, so we know what it's going to be, then the liquids that emerge are impure because the solid source that it's connected to now can impart impurity. For once the first drop emerged from them, it became impure due to contact with an egg-sized portion of impure food, and it imparts impurity to all the liquids. Same, following with the principle we've just outlined. Now, if the person squeezing the grapes was a zava, or the like, now, where's a zav and zava different to someone who had tumas mace? You'll remember there's different ways in which tuma is transferred. So as we'll explain over here. So even if they squeeze only one grape, which had not been made susceptible to ritual impurity, and they did not touch the liquid, still the liquid is impure. Why? The rationale is that when the first drop emerged, it became impure because it was carried by a zav. For a zav who carries food or liquids, imparts impurity to them, as we've already explained. Similarly, when a zav milks a goat, the milk is impure, for when the first drop emerges, it becomes impure because it is carried by a zav. So in that process, it's like the zav is carrying it, and the zav or zav, they impart impurity through masa, carrying, and therefore it would be impure. We don't need the solid to be transferring impurity to the liquid, as in the case of the person who's an avatuma, where you need the one who touched something to then be transferred to the next thing. Here we just need the fact that the zav had lifted it, and that already imparts the impurity. What happens if you got a pot filled with vegetables and you've left it in the pot to pickle? So there's a liquid and there's the solids. Now their leaves, some of the vegetable leaves are extending outside of the pot, and a primary source or a primary derivative of impurity touches the leaf that was outside the pot in a dry place. The leaves are dry and something touches it, a rishon touches it. which is going to make that leaf basically impure, right? The question really is, what happens to the rest of the pot? So he says, even though the leaf was the size of an egg, it is impure, but everything else is pure because we see it as separate. But if it is returned to the pot, and as you put it back in, where the liquid is that everything is pickling in, then it imparts impurity to all the liquids in it because it's the size of an egg. And it's a foodstuff that has tumah that can be now transferred. Now, more stringent rules apply if the impure person touched a leaf that was outside the pot that had liquid on it. First instance, it was dry. Yeah, but if it had liquid on it, so if the leaf is the size of an egg, everything, is impure. If it's less, they're not everything. But the point is over here is that it immediately, there's a connection between what's outside the pot and in the pot. The rationale is that the leaf imparts impurity to the liquid on it, and the liquid imparts impurity to all the liquids in the pot, and they impart impurity to the pot. Because when we say that something outside of the pot is considered distinct and separate from what's in the pot, that's when we're talking about something solid. So the leaves of the vegetable. But liquid is considered extended to the liquid that's in the pot. So as soon as that becomes tamei, it will impart the tumah back into everything that is in that container that is pickling. Now, a pot that was filled with pickled vegetables, that were teruma. So now remember, teruma is it different that it's more sensitive, right? So now what happens? You're pickling the vegetables that they were truma, and that was shaken by a person who had immersed that day. We spoke about this, it was yesterday or the day before. We talk about what happens, the leniencies of a mechusir kippurim, right? Someone who's gone to the mikveh, but is just waiting for the sun to set, right? So there's certain leniencies there. So let's see over here. Now you're dealing with truma and someone who's not yet gone to the mikveh, but he has gone through his process of ritual purification, and he shakes that thing. Now he discovers liquid on his hand and was in doubt whether they were sprayed from the pot or whether a stalk from a moist vegetable on the pot touched his hand. The ruling is that the vegetables are disqualified, but the pot is pure. So the direct contact that we concern may have touched will be impure, but the rest of it not. Again, in line with what we learned yesterday, I think it was where someone who's at full yom and waiting for Har Shimsha, the extent of how far the transfer is limited, and it's a leniency in that case. So that's the similar concept over here. Halacha 4. The following law applies when an impure person was partaking of grapes that had been made susceptible to ritual impurity, and one grape fell into a wine press. So he's eating the grapes, and one grape falls in. He's impure, and the grapes are susceptible. They've already become contact with liquid. So if the grape was complete and its stem had not been removed from it, the grapes in the wine press are pure. We're assuming here that it was smaller than a kazayit. If its stem was removed, then the grapes on which he took the grape that fell was stored in a storage pit and prepared to be crushed, meaning they were also liquidy. And it also indicates that he desires the liquid that emerges from them. The grape in the wine press contract impurity from the drop of liquid that emerges from the place of the stem. So if it's completely dry, it won't. But if the stem's off, which implies that there would be a little bit of a liquid at that point where the stem and the fruit are ripped apart, that would transform impurity. Should grapes fall from the hands of the impure person and he crushed them in an open place, it's not on other grapes, just in the area, the liquids that emerge from them are pure if the grapes were exactly the size of an egg or less, as we've explained, because each one does not contract from the solid that it is emerging from. If there were more than an egg-sized portion, then the liquid that emerges is impure because it will immediately contract impurity from the solid from which it is emerging. Once one drop emerges, it contracts impurity from an egg-sized portion of the impure foods, and then it imparts impurity to all the liquids that emerge afterwards, as we've just said. Halacha 8. Gush shel zaysim. The following law applies when there was a mound of impure olives that were collected and pressed together. So it's a bunch of individual olives, but they've been pressed together until they're considered joined. And that mound, that mass, was now thrown into an oven that was then lit. If the olives were exactly the size of an egg or less, the oven is pure. The rationale is that the impure food does not impart impurity to Kedim, and the oil that emerges from them is pure, as we have explained, because each one was less than a kazayit. If the mound was larger than an egg, then the olive does contract impurity. The oven, sorry. For when one drop emerges, it contracts impurity from an egg-sized shape of the impure food, egg-sized portion, of impure foods, and then from that it imparts it to the oven, because now the food is impure. The liquid is, and it imparts it to the oven. Therefore, If the impure olives are separated and not in amount, then even if there's 100 of them, you can have 100 olives. Still, it will never make the oven impure because neither one of itself will become impure to therefore transfer the impurity to the oven. So even though the olive itself is impure, it doesn't transfer to the liquid and therefore it doesn't transfer to the oven. Halacha 6, when wood that absorbed impure liquids was kindled as fuel for an oven, the oven is pure. Even though we said liquid would transfer Tumat to an oven, but here it's inside a solid, the wood. And the reason is because the liquids are considered insignificant while absorbed in the wood. And he says this is true even if the person took the wood out so that the rain would fall on it, and thus it is considered as desirable for him. Meaning, although it's technically...
You're on mute, Rabbi.
Muted yourself. Unmute.
Rabbi, you're on mute. We can't hear you. From the beginning of number 6.
Okay, can you hear me from this other device?
Now we can hear you. From number 6.
Okay, so I'm going to leave the, let me do this, hold on. So I'm not sure what's going on, but if you can hear me now. Okay, let me turn this camera off so it's not confusing anyone. Oh, one second, it says here. Can you hear me now? Okay, so okay. I don't know how that happened. Can you still hear me? Okay, I don't know what happened there. Sorry. Okay, so let's go to halacha 6. So when wood was observed, so we've just learned about liquid transferring tumah to an oven, right? That would be susceptible to tumah, an earthenware oven or whatever it might be, that would be susceptible. So when wood was absorbed, when wood that absorbed impure liquids was kindled as a fuel for an oven, the oven is pure because the liquids are considered insignificant while absorbed in the wood. Okay? And this is true, he says, even if the person took the wood out so that took it outside so that the rain would fall on it and is thus considered as desirable for him that the rain fell on it, the oven is still pure because we still consider it as secondary. The rainwater that is on the wood does not contract impurity from the liquids that are absorbed in it. That is the rule. One should not kindle the oven with this wood unless one's hands are pure. So that's an interesting proviso, right? This is a decree lest an impure person kindle the oven with such wood, and thus the liquid on it would make the oven impure. Thus the wood that absorbs liquid, not a problem. But if an impure person touches the liquid that is on the surface of it, that would make it impure, and that in turn would then affect the oven itself. Okay, halacha 7. When the carcass of a creeping animal is found in an olive mill, so it's in the mill, and only the portion, and there's some crushed olives around. Basically, it's touching a crushed olive or an area of crushed olives. He says, Only the portion which it touches contracts impurity. Because each little piece then doesn't transfer beyond itself. He says, oh, if there's liquid flowing, everything is impure. For once a little of the liquid becomes impure, the entire amount becomes impure, and then the olive will impart impurity to the olives. But if it's just broken up olives, basically it's scenario where there's broken up olives and the sheretz is touching it, it would only impart impurity to what it's touching. But if there's liquid, if there's oil around it, then that would spread the impurity. If the carcass is found on the loaves above the olives, the workers should be questioned. If they said, on the leaves above the olives, then the workers should be questioned. If they say that they did not touch the carcass, their word is accepted. It knows that the olives themselves didn't touch it. But if the carcass was found on a compressed mass of olives, the entire mass becomes impure, as we have explained, because it is connected. It's not separate pieces. If the carcass is found on separate olives, but it is touching a compressed mass of the size of an egg, everything is impure. For food, the size of an olive will impart impurity to liquid mixed with it. The liquid then impart impurity to the other olives. Now, if there were separate olives piled on other separate olives and the oil was below them, even if the carcass was touching a mass the size of an egg, only the place it touches contracts impurity, because then the liquid is under it and doesn't serve as a conduit to transfer it. Halacha 8, when an unlearned person extended his hand to a wine press and touched the cluster of grapes. Again, this Amaretz, we assume that they're not particular about keeping themselves free from ritual impurity, and therefore there's concern that they may impart impurity. So, but he's saying, nonetheless, in this instance, when an unlearned person extended his hand to a wine press and touched the clusters of grapes, the clusters he touched and those around them are impure, but the clusters in the wine press as a whole are pure. We assume impurity, but it will only infect the one that he touches and the ones immediately touching it, but not beyond that. For the clusters that are around the clusters that he touched, separated, and the remainder of those in the wine press. What's beyond it is not considered directly touched and is not transferred to. When impure people tread over the waste products of olives or grapes from which olive or wine was produced in a state of purity, and afterwards liquid emerged from them, this liquid is pure. The rationale is that originally the oil of the wine was produced in a state of purity. Even though the person that's standing on it is impure now, because the idea is that the initial oil that came out in purity. If originally the oil or the wine was produced in a state of impurity, and afterwards through the actions of these people liquid emerged, that liquid would be impure. Halacha 10. The following law applies when workers at an olive press would enter and depart, and there was impure liquid on the floor of the olive press. So if there's sufficient space between the liquids and the olives that they could dry their feet on the ground, then the olives are pure. Because a person who touches impure liquids with limbs other than his hands is pure, even with regard to consecrated foods. So as long as they can dry beforehand, no problem. Stringency is required in the following instance. There were loaves. This is what we're talking about when we talk about transferring. When will it transfer beyond what's immediately being touched? He says if you had loaves that were consecrated, so it was kachim, it was sanctified food. They had hollows and there were consecrated liquids in the hollows. You had oil inside of it. And then the carcass of a creeping animal touched one of them. And the first loaf touched the second, and the second a third, and the third a fourth, and so on. He said, even up to 100, the loaves are considered a primary derivative of impurity. They're considered rishon because of the liquid in the hollows. Now, it's not like food, which would pass 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. They all immediately become rishon l'tumah because of the liquid, due to the cherished nature of consecrated food. This is a stringency when it comes to kachim. Remember, what we have is that we've got intensity of tumah between all the different things we learned. We've got an intensity of tumah. We've got the product that would transfer tumah. And then we've got that which is now going to be susceptible. And just as there's different intensities to the tumah, and only the most intense will transfer, the more intense, the more direct the transfer, the less intense, the less direct the transfer, and also the more sensitive that the end product is, like differentiating between regular food and sanctified food, will also determine how easily it is susceptible to tumah. So that's what he's saying over here. He says this transfer, when it comes to kachim, because it's more sensitive, it can be transferred because of the liquid in it. And they are all consecrated as liquids from the secondary and tertiary derivatives are not counted, right? It's all rishon. Now, he concludes this halacha, if however the loaves were teruma, so it's one step less sensitive than something that is kachim, right? Only the third loaf is disqualified. For the third owner, from the third onward, because we know it transfers 1, 2, 3, there's the sensitivity ends. From the third onwards, the loaves are pure. If there was a liquid that could be felt on all the loaves, he says, unless there was liquid on all the loaves, then even if the loaves were truma, they'd all be impure. It would be one impurity because the liquid would basically infect them, as it were, altogether. They're all secondary derivatives except for the first that was touched by the carcass of the creeping animal. It is a primary derivative. The others would be affected the same way, equally being a secondary derivative of Tumat. And the final halacha for today, the following law applies when there's a bubble in the side of a jug and it's like another container as its side. This means like we have like if you got wood, I guess, and it's like warping. And now you've got like a hollow. So there's this almost like a blister has emerged on the wood or whatever other product it is. So now so it's like a container that's attached to a container. So now he says when the bubble was perforated to the inner space of the jug and perforated on the outwards with two holes that are on the same level, or the inner hole is lower than the outer hole. So if both the bubble and the jug contain liquids, and now a primary source of impurity touched the liquids in the bubble, just in that mini kind of container, then all the liquids contract impurity because it extends. Also, when the jug has a sealed covering on its top and it's located in a building where there was a corpse, there's a hole, right? And the tumah, we said in that instance, can infiltrate through a hole in a vessel. So even though now you've got a vessel within a vessel, but because there's holes that go through both, there's a hole into this bubble, and from the bubble into the main cavity of this vessel. So then it contracts impurity because the hole in the bubble, since it reaches into its inner space, everything in the inside becomes impure. Similarly, if the inner hole was higher than the outer hole, the jug is not protected from impurity by its sealed cover. If we're talking about purity from the corpse that's in the area, if however a primary source of impurity touched the bubble, the liquid in the jug do not contract impurity. In other words, if the inner hole is higher, because there's nowhere for it to transfer down, right? Do not contract impurity, and they're considered separate from the liquids in the bubble. Okay, that brings us to the end of chapter 11. Let's take a look at some of the questions and see if we can review the chapter together. Question 1 of 4. If honey contracted impurity, then it congealed, and then became a liquid again, does it remain in its impurity? Does it retain its impurity? Yes or no? Yes, it does, right? And it's considered a liquid all the way through. It's always a rishon. If more contracted impurity and then froze, what is the law? Got 3 options. It is still considered a liquid and therefore a primary derivative of impurity. It is considered a food and therefore secondary of impurity. When it freezes and becomes a solid, it loses the previous impurity that it contracted as a liquid. So when it freezes, is it still considered a liquid? That's really the question, do you remember? I can't hear everyone. There's something wrong with the sound, but okay. You know, it's considered a food, right? It's different to oil and to honey. Because it's not usually eaten frozen, right? And we said if it freezes, it's like food, but it has to be, then you have to intend to eat it like that, and then it becomes susceptible to tumah, and it's treated like food. Okay, when wood that absorbed impure liquid is kindled as fuel for a fire, what is the law? The oven is pure, or the oven is impure?
Oven is pure.
Oven is pure, right? Because even though there's a liquid that we said it's completely considered secondary to the wood, and we're not concerned that it transfers that impurity. 4 of 4 questions. What is the law when an unlearned person extends his hand to a wine press and touches a cluster of grapes, meaning we're assuming that he is a source of tumah? So what happens? 3 options. The cluster he touched and those around them are impure, but the clusters in the wine press as a whole are pure. That's option 1. Option 2, all of the clusters in the wine press are now impure. Option 3, only the clusters that were slightly crushed and had liquid oozing from them become impure. Okay, first one is correct because as we said, they are protected. The ones beyond the clusters that touch the immediate touch, the cluster that he was touching, are protected by those, and it doesn't transfer beyond that. Okay, shukach, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Rabbi.
Rabbi.
Thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Oh, I see. No one I can hear.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
A beautiful day and Lag Bomer Sameach. Enjoy
To you,
warmth, the light,
Rabbi.
and the
You too.
spirit of Lag Bomer.
Thank
Culture.
you.
Take care, everyone.
Enjoy the
Bye-bye.
bonfire. Enjoy the
Yeah, I hope
bonfire.
we'll get to it. It's going to be raining out tonight. Good to see you. Okay.